The Great Flood didn't just drown the wicked, it drowned genius. You've been told that Noah's Ark saved humanity from divine punishment, that the waters came to cleanse evil from the earth. But what if everything you learned about the flood is incomplete? What if those ancient waters erased something far more threatening than sin? A civilization so advanced that its ruins still mock our modern engineers. Structures built with techniques we can't replicate even with computers and cranes. Knowledge encoded in stone that shouldn't exist according to every timeline we've been taught. In Turkey, archaeologists discovered Gobekli Tepe, a temple complex carbon dated to 11,600 years ago. That's 7,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids, built by people who supposedly didn't even have metal tools or the wheel. Yet somehow they carved and transported 20-ton stone pillars decorated with symbols that suggest they understood astronomy at a level we wouldn't reach for another 5 millennia. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Cambay, sonar scans revealed something impossible. A city submerged under 120 feet of water, its streets laid out in perfect geometric grids stretching for miles. And when archaeologists carbon-dated artifacts pulled from the site, the results came back 9,500 years old, which means this metropolis was thriving when human history claims we were still learning to farm. And here's what makes your pulse quicken in the dark. Across 200 separate cultures on every inhabited continent, from the frozen Inuit tribes of the Arctic to the jungle dwellers of the Amazon, from the island nations of Polynesia to the mountain peoples of the Andes, the same story repeats with the same specific details. A warning from divine beings, a chosen survivor, a great vessel built to preserve life, animals saved in pairs, and a world that emerged from the waters fundamentally changed, emptied of something that once made it whole. This isn't coincidence anymore. This is testimony. This is the kind of corroborating evidence that would hold up in any court of law. And tonight, you're going to see why ignoring it requires more faith than believing it. You're standing at a threshold now, not just between waking and sleep, but between the history you were taught and the history the earth refuses to forget. And if you stay with me until the end, you'll see evidence they don't teach in schools. You'll understand why ancient texts from Egypt to Sumer contain mathematical constants like pi and phi, thousands of years before they were supposedly discovered. You'll learn why underwater archaeologists keep finding cities where there shouldn't be cities. And you'll discover what connects the megalithic ruins scattered across our planet, like pieces of a puzzle that mainstream archaeology refuses to assemble because completing it would mean rewriting everything. Before we descend into the deep, I need to know where you are right now. Drop a comment with your time zone or just tell me what you see outside your window. Are you watching city lights fade into the velvet dark? Are you listening to rain drum against glass in that hypnotic rhythm that makes the rest of the world disappear? Are you lying in bed while the house settles into its nighttime creaking? Because tonight, we're all standing at the same threshold together, separated by miles and time zones, but connected by something deeper. That curiosity that won't stay buried, that feeling you get when you stand before something ancient and impossible and beautiful. And some voice in your mind whispers, "This doesn't fit. This shouldn't be here. This changes everything." Tell me where you are, because this journey works better when we walk it together. When we remind ourselves that we're not alone in questioning the official narrative, that there are thousands of others out there who've felt that same strange pull when reading about a discovery that got buried in academic footnotes, who've listened to indigenous elders describe teachers who came from the sea after their homeland sank, who've stood in museums and thought the dates on these plaques don't make sense. The progression isn't linear. Something's missing from this story. And you're right to feel that way, because something is missing. A chapter that got erased, not by conspiracy, but by catastrophe. By water moving with such violence that it carved new valleys in hours and turned coastlines into ocean floors. By a reset so complete that the survivors had to start over with nothing but memory and whatever fragments of knowledge they could carry. And those fragments are what we're going to follow tonight, like breadcrumbs leading back through time to a world that existed before the rain came. Imagine yourself floating on the Mediterranean Sea right now. The water calm and black beneath a dome of stars so thick they look like spilled salt. The gentle rocking of the boat pulling you into that liminal space between consciousness and dream. And as you float there in the dark, try to picture this same spot 12,000 years ago. Not an endless expanse of water, but a fertile valley where rivers cut through green plains and cities rose from the earth with towers that caught the first light of dawn. Where marketplaces hummed with languages we no longer recognize, and children ran through streets paved with stones cut so precisely that modern masons still can't explain how it was done without lasers. You would see smoke rising from workshops where craftsmen shaped metal and glass, observatories where astronomers tracked planetary movements we didn't officially discover until we invented the telescope, libraries filled with scrolls containing geometric proofs that wouldn't be reinvented for another 10,000 years. And then you would see the sky darken, not with night, but with something else. Something that made every bird take flight at once, and every animal run for high ground. And you would hear it. That sound every flood myth describes in almost identical words. The sound of the earth breaking open, of glaciers cracking apart like bones, of water moving with such force that it rewrote the surface of the planet. The people would have heard it too, that low rumble growing louder by the second. And they would have looked at each other with the terrible understanding that everything they built, everything they knew, everything they were, was about to be erased. And maybe some of them ran. Maybe some climbed to the highest peaks they could find. Maybe some built boats and prayed to gods who seemed to have turned away. And maybe, just maybe, a few of them survived long enough to tell their children and grandchildren what the world was like before the water came. And those children told their children, and the story traveled through generations and across continents, changing languages and cultures, but keeping its core intact. Because some truths are too important to forget, even when forgetting would be easier. So if you're ready, if you're willing to question the neat progression of human civilization from caves to cities that you learned in school, if you can handle the possibility that we are not the first advanced society to call this planet home, and that everything we're so proud of inventing might actually be remembering, then take a breath. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the weight of the day begin to lift, because we're about to walk backwards through time together, not with the arrogance of modern people looking down on primitives, but with the humility of children who just discovered that the house they live in was built on foundations laid by someone else. Someone whose name we've forgotten, but whose work remains buried beneath water and sand and 12,000 years of silence. The path descends now, down through layers of time and evidence, through discoveries that make tenure committees uncomfortable, and questions that mainstream archaeology prefers not to ask. And if you follow me all the way to the end, I promise you'll never look at ancient ruins the same way again. You'll never hear the ocean the same way again. You'll understand why the stones remember what we've forgotten, and you'll see why silence can be the loudest answer of all. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Flood That Drowned Memory. You're standing on the shore of the Black Sea at twilight, the water stretching before you like hammered bronze under the dying light, waves lapping at your feet with that eternal rhythm that makes you forget what century you're in. And if you close your eyes and listen closely, you can almost hear something beneath the sound of the surf, something older than language, a whisper carried on salt air that tells you this peaceful expanse of water holds a secret it's been keeping for 12,000 years. The sand beneath your feet is fine and cold, and as you dig your toes deeper, You wonder how many layers down you'd have to go before you hit something that remembers, before you reach the level where this beach wasn't a beach at all, but the edge of a fertile valley, a place where families built homes and farmers tended fields and children played games whose rules are lost to time. Because what you're looking at now, this seemingly eternal sea, was once dry land, and the water that fills it didn't rise slowly over centuries like they taught you in school, but came in a rush so violent that entire civilizations had only hours to understand that their world was ending. But here's what makes your breath catch in the cooling evening air. Here's what pulls you deeper into this mystery that refuses to stay buried. The story of this catastrophic flood isn't some isolated incident mentioned in one ancient text by one isolated culture. It appears everywhere, in every corner of the inhabited world, told by peoples who never met each other, who were separated by vast oceans and thousands of miles, yet they all preserved the same memory with the same haunting details. And when you line up these stories side by side, when you strip away the different names and cultural dressing and look at the skeleton underneath, you find something that should be impossible. You find testimony. You find the kind of repeated corroboration that in any other field of study would be considered proof beyond reasonable doubt. Let's start with what you were taught. The version that's been scrubbed clean and simplified until it fits comfortably in a children's Bible with pictures of animals marching 2 by 2 up a wooden ramp. You know this story. There was a man named Noah who found favor with God in a world drowning in wickedness, and God gave him a warning that judgment was coming in the form of water, catastrophic water, world-ending water. And Noah was told to build an ark, a vessel so large that it would make modern naval architects pause and recalculate. 300 cubits long and 50 cubits wide and 30 cubits high, which translates to roughly 450 feet long by 75 feet wide by 45 feet high. A wooden ship larger than anything that would be successfully built again until the 19th century, when we had steel and steam and engineering degrees. Noah preached to the people around him for decades while he built this impossible boat, far from any body of water large enough to float it. And the people mocked him because of course they did. You would too if your neighbor spent 100 years building a ship in his backyard while warning about a flood that never came. Except this time, the flood did come. The text says the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the windows of heaven were opened, which is a poetic way of describing water coming from both below and above simultaneously, from the ground and from the sky. And it rained for 40 days and 40 nights without stopping. And the waters prevailed upon the earth for 150 days, and every living thing that wasn't inside that ark perished. Every person, every animal, every bird, everything with the breath of life in its nostrils, gone, erased, drowned. And when the waters finally receded, and the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, only 8 people remained to restart human civilization. Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives. 8 individuals who stepped out into a world scraped clean. A world where every city and every farm and every road and every monument to human achievement had been reduced to mud and debris scattered across a landscape they barely recognized. But here's where historians found their problem. Here's where the academic establishment looked at this story and said, it can't be true. It's too big, too dramatic, too convenient as a morality tale. And besides, how did Noah travel the entire world to warn people about the coming disaster? How did he reach the Americas and Australia and the Pacific Islands to deliver his message? And why didn't even one other person believe him enough to build their own boat? Why didn't a single king or wealthy merchant hedge their bets and construct a vessel just in case the crazy prophet was right? The logistics don't work. The geography doesn't work. The whole thing falls apart under scrutiny. And so the conclusion formed slowly but inevitably in academic circles. The flood never happened. It's myth. It's allegory. It's a story ancient people told to explain where rainbows came from and why we should be good. Case closed. File it under folklore and move on to real history. Except the story didn't stay filed. It kept showing up. And not just once or twice in related cultures, but hundreds of times in cultures that had no contact with each other, no shared language, no trade routes, no reason whatsoever to be telling the same story, unless the story was true, unless they were all remembering the same event. And when researchers like James Fraser began collecting these flood myths in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when they started laying them side by side and comparing notes, they found something that made the hair stand up on the back of their necks. The stories were too similar, unnervingly similar, impossibly similar. In Mesopotamia, predating the biblical account by at least 1,000 years, the Epic of Gilgamesh tells of Utnapishtim, who was warned by the god Ea that the other gods planned to destroy humanity with a flood. And Ea instructed Utnapishtim to tear down his house and build a boat, to abandon possessions and seek life, to take aboard the seed of all living creatures. And Utnapishtim did exactly that. He built a massive cube-shaped vessel and loaded it with his family and craftsmen and animals and silver and gold. And when the flood came, it was so terrible that even the gods cowered like dogs. The text says the gods were frightened by the deluge and retreated up to the heaven of Anu. They crouched like dogs lying by the outer wall, and for 6 days and 7 nights the wind blew and the flood and tempest overwhelmed the land. And when it finally ended, and Utnapishtim opened a hatch and looked out at the silence and saw that all of humanity had turned to clay, he wept. In India, the ancient Hindu texts tell of Manu, the first man, who was washing his hands in a river when a small fish begged him for protection, promising that if Manu saved it from larger fish, it would one day save him in return. So Manu kept the fish safe, and it grew and grew until it became so large it had to be released into the ocean. And before it swam away, it warned Manu that a great flood was coming that would destroy all life. And it told him to build a ship and take aboard the 7 sages and samples of all the seeds and all the animals. And when the flood came and the waters rose until they covered even the highest mountains, the fish returned, now revealed as the god Vishnu in disguise, and Manu tied his ship to the fish's horn and was towed to safety while the rest of the world drowned beneath the waves. The Maya had their flood story in the Popol Vuh, where the gods destroyed the wooden people they had created because these early humans lacked souls and couldn't properly worship their makers. So the gods sent a great flood and a black rain that fell day and night, and even the animals turned against the wooden people, and their cooking pots and grinding stones rose up to attack them. Everything they had made rebelled against them, and they tried to climb onto their roofs, but the houses collapsed. They tried to climb trees, but the trees shook them off. They tried to hide in caves, but the caves slammed shut, and the wooden people were destroyed utterly to make way for the creation of true humans made from corn. In Greece, Zeus looked down on the Bronze Age of humanity and saw that they were violent and impious, and he decided to destroy them with a flood. But Prometheus warned his son Deucalion, and Deucalion built a chest and stocked it with provisions and climbed inside with his wife Pyrrha, and Zeus opened the sky and rained for 9 days and 9 nights until all of Greece was underwater and all its people were drowned, except for a few who fled to the high mountains. And when the waters receded, Deucalion's chest came to rest on Mount Parnassus, and he and Pyrrha emerged as the only survivors to repopulate the earth. The Chinese have the story of Gunyu and the Great Flood that lasted for generations, waters that covered the mountains and threatened to drown all of civilization, and Gun was appointed by the emperor to control the flood. But he failed and was executed, and his son Yu took up the task and labored for 13 years. And the texts say Yu was so devoted to stopping the flood that he passed by his own house 3 times and heard his children crying, but didn't stop to see them because the work was too important. And eventually he succeeded in draining the waters and making the land habitable again. The Australian Aborigines tell of a time when the sea level was much lower and the coast extended far beyond where it is today. And they speak of islands that are now underwater and of a great flood that came and drowned the land. And remarkably, modern oceanographic studies have confirmed that the Aboriginal stories accurately describe coastlines as they existed over 10,000 years ago, which means these oral traditions have been maintained with precision for at least 10 millennia, passed down through hundreds of generations without being written down, kept alive purely through the discipline of memory and the sacredness of the story. Do you see the pattern emerging here in the fading light as you stand on that black sea shore with the water lapping at your feet? These aren't vague similarities. These are specific, repeated elements that show up again and again across cultures that should have nothing in common. Element 1. There is always a warning, always advance notice from a divine source or a wise being who knows what's coming. And this warning is given to one person or one family who is chosen for their righteousness or wisdom, or some quality that sets them apart from their corrupted society. Element 2. The chosen survivor is instructed to build a vessel. Sometimes it's a boat, sometimes it's a chest or a box or a raft. But it's always something that floats, something that can ride out the catastrophe while everything else drowns. Element 3. Animals must be saved, the seed of all living things, breeding pairs or groups sufficient to repopulate after the waters recede. Because the flood isn't meant to extinguish life entirely, but to reset it, to wash away the corruption and start again with a clean foundation. Element 4. The flood, when it comes, is beyond imagination. It doesn't just overflow riverbanks or swamp coastal areas. It covers mountains. It reaches the sky. It transforms the entire world into an alien waterscape where nothing that was remains recognizable. And element 5. After the waters recede, there is a new beginning, a fresh start, and the survivors who emerge are tasked with rebuilding civilization, with repopulating the earth, with carrying forward whatever knowledge and wisdom they managed to preserve through the catastrophe. This pattern repeats over 200 times across every inhabited continent, in the myths of peoples who were separated by vast distances and had no way to communicate. The Norse had Bergelmir, who survived when Ymir's blood drowned the world. The Inca had Viracocha, who destroyed the giants with a flood before creating new humans. The Aztecs had Coxcoxtli, who built a boat to survive the flood that ended the fourth sun. The Hawaiians spoke of a flood sent by Kane to destroy an earlier race of people. The list goes on and on and on, until dismissing it as coincidence becomes absurd, until the only reasonable conclusion is that all these cultures are remembering the same event, describing the same catastrophe from their different vantage points across the globe. And here's what researchers like Mircea Eliade and Joseph Campbell pointed out. Here's what makes this even more remarkable. Many of these cultures had no contact with the biblical tradition. They weren't influenced by missionaries or traders bringing the Noah story from the Middle East. The Aboriginal flood myths were recorded before significant European contact. The American flood myths existed long before Columbus. These are independent traditions that converged on the same narrative because they were all preserving memory, real memory, traumatic memory of something that actually happened. An event so devastating and so universal that every surviving population on Earth incorporated it into their foundation stories, into their explanations of how the current world came to be. So you stand there on that black sea shore as the sun finally slips below the horizon and the first stars begin to prick through the darkening sky, and you have to ask yourself, if the flood really happened, if it wasn't myth but memory, if 200 cultures aren't all making up the same elaborate lie, but rather telling different versions of the same truth, then what does that mean? What does it mean about the world that existed before the water came? Because here's the terrifying, beautiful possibility that keeps you awake at night once you start following this thread. If the flood destroyed a world and left only scattered survivors, if it wiped the slate so clean that civilization had to begin again almost from scratch, then what kind of world was it that drowned? The standard narrative says early humans were primitive, that 12,000 years ago we were barely past the hunter-gatherer stage, that we lived in small nomadic bands and had only just begun to figure out agriculture. But if that's true, why would the gods bother flooding us? Why would a catastrophe of such magnitude be necessary to destroy a species that barely had fire and stone tools? Unless we weren't primitive at all. Unless the world before the flood was something else entirely, something advanced, something that had risen high enough that its fall required divine intervention or cosmic accident. Something that built cities and monuments and accumulated knowledge that made the gods or the universe, or blind chance, decide it was time to reset the counter back to zero. The flood story is no myth. You understand that now. As the darkness gathers around you, and the waves continue their eternal rhythm, it's memory. It's testimony. It's humanity's way of saying, this happened to us. We were here, and then the water came, and most of us died. But a few remembered, and we're telling you so you'll remember too, so the knowledge won't die completely. So someone in the future will know that the world you see is not the first world, that there was something before, something that drowned, something that left traces, if you know where to look. Are you ready to look? Because the earth keeps its own records. It doesn't forget the way humans forget. And if the flood was real, then geology should remember it. The rocks and soil and sediment should bear witness. And that's exactly what we're going to find as we continue this descent together. We're going to find that the earth has been trying to tell us what happened, leaving evidence in plain sight that we've been trained to ignore or explain away. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you understand what you're looking at, the world transforms before your eyes. The Black Sea behind you is growing invisible in the full dark now, just a sound and a presence. And somewhere out there beneath those waves are the ruins of the world that was, settlements and roads, and maybe even cities that were swallowed when the water broke through and turned a valley into a sea. And those ruins sit in the cold and the dark, and they wait. They wait for someone to find them, to bring light and cameras and sonar, to map their streets and excavate their homes, and piece together the story of the people who lived there before the day the ocean broke through the barrier and everything changed in a matter of hours. But we're not diving into those particular ruins tonight. Instead, we're heading west, to a place in North America where the earth itself bears the scars of water moving with such violence that it carved new valleys through solid bedrock, where the evidence is so overwhelming that even mainstream science had to eventually admit that yes, this happened. Yes, megafloods are real. Yes, water can reshape a continent in days rather than millennia. And once you see what the Scablands have to teach us, you'll understand that the flood myths aren't talking about rivers overflowing their banks or unusually high tides. They're describing something that defies imagination, something that validates every ancient text that speaks of the world drowning beneath the wrath of heaven. Let's keep walking. The path continues, and the stones are ready to speak. Chapter 2. The Earth Remembers. You're standing in the middle of what looks like a battleground between gods, a landscape so alien and violent that your first instinct is to check if you've somehow been transported to Mars, because this doesn't look like Earth, not the Earth of gentle rivers and gradual erosion and changes measured in millions of years. This looks like something exploded here, like the planet's skin was ripped open and left to scar in massive rippling wounds that stretch as far as you can see. Welcome to the channeled Scablands of eastern Washington state. 16,000 square miles of terrain that makes geologists go quiet when they first encounter it. And you're walking across ground that holds a secret so powerful that when one man first suggested what really happened here, the entire scientific establishment laughed him out of the room, and it took 50 years and satellite photography before they finally admitted he was right all along. The wind cuts across the open land with nothing to stop it, carrying the scent of sage and dust, and beneath your feet the basalt rock has been carved into channels and gouges and ripples the size of houses. Patterns that shouldn't exist. Patterns that look exactly like what you'd see in a riverbed, except these ripples are 30 feet high, and the channels are hundreds of feet deep, and the river that made them would have had to be moving faster than you can properly imagine, faster than any river on Earth moves today, faster than seems possible for water to move without turning into something else entirely. You kneel down and run your hand along one of these grooves in the stone, feeling the smoothness where something abraded the rock like sandpaper, and you try to picture the force required to carve solid basalt this way. Try to imagine water carrying boulders the size of cars and using them as grinding tools against bedrock that's supposed to be nearly indestructible. And the numbers you come up with seem impossible. The volume of water needed, the velocity, the sheer destructive power. It's beyond anything in recorded history, beyond anything that fits the comfortable narrative of slow geological change. And yet here it is beneath your fingers, undeniable, patient, waiting for someone to read the story it's been trying to tell for 12,000 years. But here's what no one talks about in the textbooks. Even now that they've finally accepted the Scablands were carved by megafloods, here's the question that should keep you awake once you understand what you're looking at. If water can do this to solid rock in a matter of hours or days, if it can completely reshape 16,000 square miles of landscape faster than a human lifetime, what else did it destroy that we'll never find because it was made of softer materials than basalt? What cities or roads or monuments or evidence of civilization got swept away and ground to powder and scattered across the Pacific Ocean, while this stone testimony survived only because it was too hard to erase completely? The story begins in the 1920s with a geologist named J. Harlen Bretz, a man who had the misfortune of being right at exactly the wrong time in exactly the wrong way. Because Bretz looked at the Scablands and saw what everyone else had been trained not to see. He saw catastrophe. He saw violence. He saw evidence of something that happened fast and furious, and completely at odds with the gradualist philosophy that dominated geology ever since Charles Lyell convinced everyone that the present is the key to the past, and everything happens slowly over vast stretches of time. Bretz proposed something radical. He said these channels and coulees and dry waterfalls weren't carved by normal rivers over millions of years. They were carved by a flood so massive and so violent that it would have made the biblical deluge look tame by comparison. A wall of water hundreds of feet high, moving at speeds up to 60 miles per hour, carrying icebergs and boulders and entire forests in its grip, scouring the landscape down to bedrock and then vanishing, leaving behind this tortured terrain as the only evidence that it had ever existed. When Bretz presented his findings to the Geological Society of Washington, D.C. in 1923, the room erupted in polite academic scorn. Senior geologists stood up one after another to explain why he was wrong, to insist that there was no mechanism that could produce such a flood, that the evidence could be explained by conventional processes given enough time, that catastrophism was outdated thinking left over from religious believers who wanted to prove the Bible right. And Bretz stood there and took it, because he knew what he'd seen. He knew the Scablands couldn't be explained away. But he also knew he was fighting against an entire paradigm, against the foundational assumption of his field. And paradigms don't change easily. They fight back. They protect themselves. They make heretics out of anyone who challenges them. For decades, Bretz was marginalized. His papers were rejected. His ideas were dismissed in classrooms. Young geologists were warned not to follow his thinking if they wanted to have careers. And the Scablands sat there under the Washington sky, unchanging, patient, waiting for the rest of science to catch up to what they'd been screaming all along. The breakthrough came in the 1950s and 60s, when aerial photography, and then satellite imagery, made it possible to see the Scablands from above, to view the whole system at once, rather than trying to piece it together from ground level. And suddenly, the pattern became undeniable. You could see the flood path. You could trace where the water came from and where it went. You could measure the volume required to create these features. And every calculation pointed to the same impossible conclusion. Bretz had been right. Catastrophically right. There had been a megaflood, or rather, multiple megafloods. Because it didn't happen just once. It happened dozens of times, over the span of about 3,000 years during the last ice age. Here's what scientists now believe occurred. And pay attention, because this is important for understanding not just the Scablands, but the global pattern of catastrophic flooding that shows up in those 200 flood myths we talked about earlier. During the Ice Age, a massive glacial lake called Lake Missoula formed behind an ice dam in what is now Montana. And this wasn't some ordinary lake. At its maximum extent, it contained more than 500 cubic miles of water, as much as Lake Erie and Lake Ontario combined. A body of water so vast that if you stood on one shore, you couldn't see the other side even on the clearest day. But ice dams are unstable. They're temporary structures at best. And when the climate warmed even slightly, or when the water pressure became too great, the dam would fail. Not gradually, but catastrophically. The ice would shatter, and 500 cubic miles of water would be released all at once. Imagine opening a bathtub drain. Except the bathtub is the size of a great lake, and the drain is as wide as a state. And all that water has to go somewhere. So it goes west, following the path of least resistance, funneling through mountain passes and spreading out across the Scablands like a liquid hammer, moving at speeds that turned water into a demolition tool, carrying so much sediment and debris that it was more like wet concrete than a river. And the sound would have been beyond description, a roar that could be heard for hundreds of miles, the sound of the earth being rewritten in real time. The flood would have lasted days, maybe weeks, depending on the size of the ice dam failure, and when it finally drained away, it left behind those channels and ripples and dry waterfalls and scattered boulders called erratics that geologists found sitting in places where no normal process could have deposited them. House-sized chunks of granite resting on top of basalt dozens of miles from their source, carried there by icebergs floating on the floodwaters and then dropped when the ice melted. And each of these erratics is a monument to the power of moving water, a gravestone for a catastrophe that shouldn't be possible, according to uniformitarian geology. Now multiply that by 40 or 50 separate flood events over 3,000 years, and you begin to understand why the Scablands look the way they do, why the landscape seems tortured, why driving through it feels like moving across the surface of an alien planet, because it was hit again and again by forces that make modern floods look like minor inconveniences. And the only reason we know about it is because the basalt was tough enough to survive with the scars intact. But here's where it gets interesting for our purposes. Here's where the Scablands connect to the larger pattern we're investigating. Researchers like Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock have pointed out that the Missoula floods coincide almost exactly with the younger Dryas period, a sudden return to Ice Age conditions that lasted from roughly 12,800 years ago to 11,600 years ago. And during this period, there's evidence of massive flooding events all over the planet, not just in Washington, but in Siberia, in Europe, around the Black Sea, in the Middle East, across Asia, along coastal regions worldwide. Almost as if something happened to destabilize ice sheets globally and send meltwater surging across the landscape in a synchronized catastrophe. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests that a comet or asteroid broke apart and peppered the northern hemisphere with fragments, causing massive wildfires, instantly melting portions of the ice sheet, triggering volcanic eruptions from the sudden change in pressure as millions of tons of ice disappeared, and sending civilization, such as it was, into a catastrophic reset. And while this hypothesis remains controversial in mainstream science, the evidence keeps mounting. They found a layer of sediment from this exact time period that contains nanodiamonds and iridium and spherules and other markers of extraterrestrial impact. They've found evidence of massive wildfires in the carbon record. They found extinction events that wiped out dozens of large mammal species in North America within a geological instant. And they've found that sea levels rose dramatically during this period as ice melted faster than the oceans could gradually absorb it. So imagine you're living 12,800 years ago. Imagine your people have built cities along what are now coastlines, but were then river valleys dozens of miles from the sea. Imagine you have agriculture and trade networks and astronomical observatories and libraries. Imagine you've developed mathematics and engineering and metallurgy. And then one night, the sky lights up with streaks of fire. Impacts shake the ground, forests ignite, ice sheets crack and groan and begin to collapse. And within days or weeks, the water comes. Not rising gradually, but arriving as a wall, a tsunami of meltwater and debris that drowns everything in its path. And you run. You grab your children and whatever you can carry, and you run for high ground. But the water keeps rising. It rises past the hills, past the mountains. It rises until the world you knew is gone, and you're clinging to whatever floats with a handful of other survivors. And when it's finally over, when the waters recede and you can descend again to solid ground, everything is gone. Every city, every farm, every monument, every library, every piece of evidence that your civilization ever existed, all of it buried under layers of mud and sediment, or swept out to sea, or ground to powder between tumbling boulders. And you're left with nothing but memory, and a handful of tools, and the terrible task of starting over with whatever knowledge you can preserve through oral tradition. This is what the Scablands teach us. This is why Bretz fought so hard to make people understand what they were looking at. Because the evidence of catastrophic flooding isn't some minor geological footnote. It's proof that the world can change overnight, that civilizations can be erased so thoroughly that only fragments remain. And those fragments might not even be recognized for what they are by people who come after, who find strange ruins and assume they're natural formations, who discover impossible artifacts and file them away as anomalies, who encounter flood myths in every culture and dismiss them as primitive fantasies. You're still standing there in the Scablands with the wind in your face and the scarred basalt beneath your feet. And now, when you look at these channels, you see them differently. You see them as a warning and a testimony. You see them as the Earth's way of keeping the record that humans forgot. And you start to wonder what else the Earth remembers. What other catastrophes are written in stone and sediment and underwater topography? What other evidence has been sitting in plain sight, waiting for someone to read it correctly? And here's the truly unsettling thought that settles over you as the sun climbs higher and throws the Scabland features into sharp relief. If the Missoula floods could carve 16,000 square miles of landscape in days, if water moving at 60 miles per hour could gouge channels hundreds of feet deep through solid bedrock, then what happened to the structures that were in its path? Because there had to be something here. The climate before the younger Dryas was relatively warm. The ice sheets were retreating. This would have been habitable land, possibly prime habitable land with rivers and forests and game. And if humans were present anywhere in North America 12,000 years ago, they would have been here. But we find almost nothing. A few stone tools, a handful of campsites, nothing that suggests permanent settlement. And mainstream archaeology says that's because humans in North America were still nomadic hunter-gatherers at this point. They hadn't developed agriculture or architecture or settled communities. But what if that's not because they hadn't developed those things? What if it's because the floods erased every trace of development and we're looking at a landscape that's been scrubbed clean? What if we're mistaking absence of evidence for evidence of absence, when really we're just looking at the aftermath of something so destructive that it reset the archaeological record back to zero? The Scablands don't answer that question. They can't. They're just stone and wind and silence. But they do prove that catastrophic flooding happened. They prove that water can reshape continents. They prove that the gradualist assumptions that dominated geology for 150 years were wrong. And if those assumptions were wrong about the Scablands, what else are they wrong about? What other evidence of catastrophe has been explained away or ignored because it doesn't fit the preferred narrative of slow change over deep time? You take one last look at the rippled basalt, at the testimony carved in stone, and you feel something shift in your understanding, because you're starting to see the pattern now. The flood myths aren't myths. The geological evidence isn't anomalous. The pieces are fitting together into a picture that mainstream academia doesn't want to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would mean rewriting too many textbooks, reconsidering too many assumptions, opening too many uncomfortable doors. But the doors are opening anyway, slowly, reluctantly, one piece of evidence at a time, and the next door we're going to walk through leads to structures that shouldn't exist. Monuments built by people who supposedly didn't have the knowledge or tools or organization to build them. Megalithic ruins scattered across the planet like pieces of a puzzle that was smashed apart and partially destroyed. And when you see what's still standing, despite everything the earth has thrown at it, you'll understand that whoever came before us, whoever was here in the world that drowned, they weren't primitive. They weren't simple. They knew things we've forgotten, and they left messages in stone, because stone is the only material that survives catastrophe, the only medium that can carry memory across the kind of time spans that erase everything else. The wind picks up, carrying dust from the channeled basalt, and you turn to face the direction the floodwaters flowed, west, toward the Pacific. And you wonder what's out there beneath the waves. What ruins sit on the continental shelf in 300 feet of water, drowned when the ice melted and the sea levels rose, waiting in the cold and the dark for technology to advance far enough that we can go down and look, and finally see what we lost when the world changed. Let's keep moving. The stones have more to say, and the next chapter is carved in blocks so massive that moving them defies modern engineering. Let's go see what couldn't be washed away. Chapter 3. Stones that shouldn't exist. You're standing on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey just as the sun breaks over the horizon, and the first golden light touches stone pillars that rise from the earth like fingers reaching toward a sky they've been watching for 11,600 years. And your breath catches, because you know what you're looking at even though it makes no sense. Even though every textbook you've ever read says this can't be here, that the people who built this didn't exist yet, that human civilization in 9,600 BC was supposed to be small bands of hunter-gatherers following animal migrations and living in temporary shelters. Not this. Never this. Not massive T-shaped pillars weighing 20 tons each, carved with intricate reliefs of animals and abstract symbols, and arranged in perfect circles that align with celestial events. Welcome to Gobekli Tepe, the place that broke archaeology, the discovery that forced scholars to push back the timeline of human achievement by thousands of years. And even then they couldn't quite explain it, couldn't fit it into any narrative that made sense. Because this temple complex predates the invention of pottery, predates the domestication of animals, predates the development of agriculture. It predates everything we thought had to come first before humans could organize the labor and develop the skills to create monumental architecture. And yet, here it stands, deliberately buried by its builders sometime around 8000 BC, for reasons we can only guess at. Preserved under tons of soil until 1994, when a Kurdish shepherd noticed shaped stones on this hill, and archaeologists came to investigate and realized they'd found something that rewrote history. You walk closer to one of the pillars, the limestone cool under your palm despite the warming air, and you trace the carved lines of a fox, its details still crisp after all these millennia, and beside it, a vulture with outstretched wings, and below that, geometric patterns that might be purely decorative or might encode information we no longer know how to read. And you think about the hands that carved this, the tools they used, the knowledge they possessed. Because creating relief carvings on stone this hard requires specific techniques, requires understanding of how the stone will fracture, requires tools harder than limestone, requires time and skill, and most of all, it requires a reason, a driving purpose important enough to justify the immense labor involved. The standard explanation, the one that lets archaeologists sleep at night, is that Gobekli Tepe represents the birth of organized religion, that hunter-gatherers in this region began gathering for seasonal ceremonies, and the need to build a permanent sacred space drove them to create these structures. And this religious impulse then led to the development of agriculture, because they needed to feed the workers and the pilgrims. So in this view, religion came first, and civilization followed from it. Which is a nice story, except it doesn't explain how people with no prior experience building anything permanent suddenly acquired the engineering knowledge to quarry and transport and erect 20-ton pillars, or how they developed sophisticated carving techniques with no archaeological evidence of earlier, simpler attempts. Or why the oldest layers of Gobekli Tepe show the most advanced work, while later additions become progressively cruder, as if the builders were losing knowledge rather than gaining it. You move to the center of the circular structure and turn slowly, counting the pillars, noting how they're arranged not randomly, but according to some plan, some design that takes into account not just aesthetics, but function. And modern analysis has shown that the site has acoustic properties, that standing in certain positions and making sounds creates resonances and echoes that would have made ceremonies held here particularly powerful, particularly memorable. Which means the builders understood not just stoneworking, but also sound engineering. They knew how shape and space affect how voices and music carry. They were applying principles that we didn't supposedly discover until much later in our neat, linear progression from primitive to advanced. But here's what really makes your skin prickle as the morning light strengthens and brings out colors in the stone you didn't notice before. Gobekli Tepe isn't unique. It's just the oldest and most famous example of a pattern that repeats across the globe. Megalithic structures built with precision that defies their supposed time period, using techniques we can't replicate, demonstrating knowledge that shouldn't exist, and often showing that same troubling characteristic where the earliest versions are the most sophisticated and later work represents decline rather than improvement. As if these sites weren't built by civilizations rising, but by civilizations falling, by survivors trying to remember and recreate something they'd lost. Think about Pumapunku in Bolivia, a temple complex at 13,000 feet above sea level where blocks of andesite and diorite stone, some weighing over 100 tons, have been shaped with such precision that they fit together like Lego pieces, with interior angles that are perfect right angles, measured to tolerances that modern stoneworkers struggle to achieve even with diamond-tipped power tools. And these blocks show evidence of being cut with something other than the bronze and copper tools that the Tiwanaku culture supposedly possessed. The cuts are too clean, too precise, too consistent. They look machine-made, except machines didn't exist in 500 AD when mainstream archaeology dates the site. Although some researchers argue, based on astronomical alignments and erosion patterns, that parts of Pumapunku might be much older. possibly contemporary with, or even predating Gobekli Tepe, built by someone else and later occupied by the Tiwanaku, who had no memory of the original builders and couldn't replicate their techniques. Or consider the temple complex at Baalbek in Lebanon, where the foundation includes 3 limestone blocks called the Trilithon, each weighing approximately 800 tons. That's 1,600,000 pounds per stone. And these aren't rough-cut boulders, but precisely shaped rectangular blocks that fit together so tightly you can't slide a piece of paper between them. And they sit about 20 feet above ground level, which means they were somehow lifted and positioned with accuracy. And nearby in the quarry lies an even larger block called the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, weighing around 1,000 tons, that was partially cut from the bedrock and abandoned, as if the builders ran out of time or resources, or perhaps were interrupted by some catastrophe. And modern engineers looking at these stones openly admit they have no idea how they were moved. Every scenario they model requires technology that didn't exist, cranes that couldn't have been built from available materials, transport systems that would have required infrastructure there's no evidence for. And yet the stones are there, undeniably real, waiting patiently for someone to explain them. You turn your attention back to Gobekli Tepe, to the pillars surrounding you, and you notice something you missed before. The stones have weathering patterns that seem inconsistent with 11,600 years of exposure. Or rather, some parts are weathered and some aren't, as if the structure went through periods of being buried and exposed, or as if it was damaged and repaired multiple techniques. And this makes you wonder whether what you're looking at is a original construction from 9,600 BC or a reconstruction, an attempt by survivors to rebuild something they remembered from before, working from memory and degraded skills to recreate monuments that once stood even taller, even more complex, before the floodwaters came and toppled them, and forced humanity to start over with diminished knowledge. The story archaeology tells is one of steady progress, of humans slowly figuring things out over thousands of years, inventing agriculture, then pottery, then metallurgy, then writing, then architecture, each development building logically on what came before in a nice, neat progression. But the stones tell a different story. They tell a story of catastrophic loss and desperate preservation, of knowledge that existed fully formed and then disappeared, leaving only fragments and fading memories, and attempts to rebuild that fell short of the original glory. Look at the Osirion in Egypt, the mysterious structure beneath the temple of Seti I at Abydos, where massive blocks of granite and limestone are fitted together with no mortar, in a style completely unlike dynastic Egyptian construction. The blocks are larger, the joinery is tighter, the overall aesthetic is more austere and somehow more advanced. And Orthodox Egyptology says the Osirion was built around 1300 BC, during the reign of Seti I. But geologists looking at water erosion patterns suggest it might be thousands of years older, possibly predating dynastic Egypt entirely. And if that's true, then the implication is staggering. It means the Egypt we know, the Egypt of the pharaohs and the pyramids and the hieroglyphs, was built on top of something older, was inheriting and repurposing structures from a predecessor civilization that mainstream history doesn't acknowledge. You walk around the perimeter of the Gobekli Tepe enclosure, studying how the pillars were set into carved slots in the bedrock, how the whole structure was designed to be both beautiful and functional, and you try to imagine the logistics involved in building this, the number of workers required, the organization needed to feed and house them, the social structure that could command such labor. And every model you build in your mind requires a level of societal complexity that shouldn't exist in 9,600 BC. Requires agriculture to support a specialized workforce, except agriculture wasn't invented yet, according to the timeline. Requires administrative systems to coordinate the work, except writing wasn't invented yet. Requires long-distance trade to acquire tools and materials, except trade networks weren't established yet. And round you go, until you're forced to either reject the evidence of your eyes or reject the timeline you were taught. And the stones don't care which you choose. They'll still be here either way, patient as only stone can be. Think about what Klaus Schmidt found when he excavated Gobekli Tepe. Think about his realization that the site had been deliberately buried, not abandoned, and slowly covered by wind-blown soil over centuries, but intentionally filled in with rubble and earth, carefully entombed, as if the builders were preserving it, hiding it, protecting it from something. And Schmidt suggested maybe they were protecting it from religious changes, from new beliefs that required the old temples to be hidden away. But what if they were protecting it from something more immediate, more physical? What if they knew the water was coming? What if the same catastrophe that created the Scablands and drowned the Black Sea Valley and left flood myths in 200 cultures also threatened Gobekli Tepe, and the builders chose to bury it rather than let it be destroyed, chose to hide their achievement under tons of soil where it would wait for humanity to reach a point where it could be found again and understood. You sit down with your back against one of the pillars, feeling the solidity of stone that has witnessed the passage of over 10,000 years, and you let the implications wash over you like water. Because if Gobekli Tepe is what it appears to be, if it represents knowledge and capability that existed fully formed in 9600 BC, then where did that knowledge come from? How did it arise? Because the standard model of human development doesn't allow for this, doesn't permit a quantum leap from nomadic hunter-gatherers to sophisticated temple builders with no intermediate steps. There should be centuries or millennia of progressively more complex structures showing the learning curve, showing the mistakes and corrections and gradual improvement. But instead, you find Gobekli Tepe springing into existence already mature, already competent, already encoding astronomical knowledge and acoustic engineering and symbolic systems we still can't fully decode. And here's the thought that won't leave you alone now that it's taken root. What if Gobekli Tepe isn't the beginning of something, but the end? What if it's not the first temple ever built, but one of the last surviving examples of a building tradition that was already ancient by 9600 BC? What if the people who carved these pillars were working from plans and memories inherited from their ancestors who lived before the younger Dryas, before the floods, before the catastrophe that reset the world, and they built this temple not as an innovation, but as an act of preservation, a way of saying, we were here, we knew things, we understood the sky and the stone, and the sacred geometry that connects them. And even though our cities drowned, and our libraries burned, and most of our knowledge was lost, we're leaving this for whoever comes after, carved in stone, because stone survives when everything else fails. The sun is fully up now, warming the limestone, and you stand and take one last look at the circle of pillars, at the carvings that have outlasted empires. And you understand something fundamental has shifted in your perception of history. You can't go back to the simple narrative of steady progress, can't unsee the evidence that human civilization is older and stranger and more cyclical than you were taught, that we've risen before and fallen before. And maybe the ruins scattered across our planet aren't markers of our first attempts at greatness, but remnants of our second, or third, or 10th attempt, echoes of worlds that came before this one. But Gobekli Tepe is just one piece of the puzzle, one data point in a global pattern, and there are other sites calling for attention, other impossible structures demanding explanation, and some of them are underwater now, drowned when the ice melted and the seas rose. And that's where we're heading next. Down beneath the waves to cities that shouldn't exist, to streets and buildings and harbors sitting in darkness, at depths that tell us exactly when they were submerged, giving us dates that align disturbingly well with those flood myths, with the younger Dryas boundary, with the catastrophe that the earth remembers, even if we've tried to forget. You make your way back down the hill, leaving Gobekli Tepe to its eternal watch, and you carry with you the weight of questions that don't have comfortable answers. Questions about who we were and what we've forgotten, and whether the knowledge we're so proud of rediscovering might actually be remembering. Might be fragments of understanding that existed once before and got lost when the world drowned and had to be painstakingly pieced back together by survivors working from incomplete memories and damaged tools. The stones have spoken. They've testified to knowledge that predates history, to capabilities that mock our assumptions. And now the waters are waiting to add their testimony, to show us what lies beneath, what got swallowed when the earth decided it was time for a reset. And if you thought the megalithic ruins on dry land were unsettling, wait until you see what's been hiding in the cold and the dark and the pressure of the deep. Wait until you understand how much of our past is still down there, waiting to be found. Let's descend into the blue. Let's follow the drowned coastlines to their secrets. The path continues and the pressure is building. And soon you'll see cities that weren't supposed to exist, built by people history doesn't remember, in a world that got erased so thoroughly that we almost forgot it was ever there. Chapter 4. The Vanished Motherland. You're standing on Easter Island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, 2,300 miles from the nearest continent, on a volcanic rock so remote that the ancient Polynesians who settled here called it Tepito o Tehenua, the navel of the world. And you're looking up at a stone face 40 feet tall that's been staring out to sea for centuries, one of 887 Moai statues scattered across this tiny island. And the question that won't leave you alone is the same question that's haunted researchers since Europeans first arrived here in 1722. Why would a small population living on an isolated speck of land in the middle of nowhere dedicate so much time and resources to carving and transporting and erecting these massive stone sentinels? What were they looking for out there across the endless blue? What were they remembering? What were they mourning? The Moai are carved from compressed volcanic ash, each one weighing between 10 and 80 tons, and they were quarried at Rano Raraku volcano and somehow moved across the island to their final positions on stone platforms called ahu, and the engineering required to accomplish this without metal tools or wheeled vehicles or draft animals is remarkable enough. But it's the expression on their faces that stops you, that long-jawed, angular look that seems to carry profound sadness, as if these stone giants are waiting for something that will never come, watching for ships from a homeland that no longer exists. The local Rapa Nui people, when asked by early European visitors about who built the Moai and why, gave an answer that archaeologists filed away as myth and largely ignored. They said the statues were erected to honor their ancestors, the original people who came from a land to the west that was swallowed by the sea, a place of great knowledge and power that sank beneath the waves during a cataclysm. And the Moai face the ocean because they're looking back toward that lost homeland, maintaining an eternal vigil for something that can never return. This is where the Mu hypothesis enters our story, not as proven fact, but as a persistent possibility that refuses to die, despite lacking the concrete evidence that would satisfy mainstream archaeology. And whether you believe in a literal lost continent, or interpret it as cultural memory of scattered island nations that were indeed swallowed by rising seas, the pattern is undeniable. Across the Pacific, you find islands with massive stone structures that seem too sophisticated for their supposed builders, oral traditions that speak of migrations from drowned lands, and knowledge of navigation and astronomy that required generations of accumulated wisdom to develop. The story begins in the 19th century with a French-American archaeologist named Augustus Le Plongeon, who spent years studying Mayan ruins in the Yucatan and became convinced that the Maya were not the origin point of their civilization, but rather the inheritors of something older, something he called the Mother Civilization. And he believed this mother culture had existed in the Pacific before some catastrophe destroyed it, and sent survivors fleeing in all directions, carrying fragments of knowledge that would resurface in Egypt, in India, in Southeast Asia, in the Americas, explaining why you find pyramids and astronomical alignments and flood myths in cultures that supposedly never had contact with each other. Le Plongeon's work was largely dismissed by the academic establishment of his time, filed away as the fantasies of an overzealous researcher seeing patterns where none existed. But then, in the early 20th century, a British writer and inventor named James Churchward picked up the thread and ran with it, claiming that during his time in India, he'd been shown ancient tablets by a temple priest, tablets written in a script the priest called Nakal. And these tablets supposedly told the story of Mu, a vast continent in the Pacific that was home to an advanced civilization of 64 million people who possessed technology and knowledge that wouldn't be matched until modern times. And this Empire of the Sun, as Churchward called it, existed for thousands of years before geological catastrophe caused the land to sink beneath the waves in a matter of days, leaving only the highest mountain peaks as the islands we see today scattered across the Pacific. Now, before you dismiss this entirely as Victorian adventure fiction, consider what Churchward got right, even if his specifics were wrong. He understood that ocean levels have changed dramatically over the past 15,000 years, that what is now seafloor was once dry land, that entire landscapes with rivers and forests and potentially human settlements now sit under hundreds of feet of water. And he recognized that oral traditions preserved in island cultures often contain accurate geographical and historical information encoded in metaphor and myth. And modern oceanography has proven him correct on these points, even if the literal continent of Mu remains unproven. You walk among the Moai, placing your hand on sun-warmed stone, and you think about the Rapa Nui tradition that says the statues walked to their positions, that they moved upright across the island through some combination of ropes and leverage and knowledge that's been lost. And recent experiments have shown this is actually possible, that with the right technique and enough people, you can indeed make a Moai walk by rocking it forward on its base, which means the oral tradition preserved accurate information about construction methods for centuries after the actual practice stopped. So if they accurately remembered how the statues moved, what else might their stories preserve? The Pacific is full of these tantalizing hints, these fragments of memory that point towards something larger. The Polynesian navigators who could find islands separated by thousands of miles of open ocean using only observations of stars and waves and birds, carrying with them an understanding of celestial mechanics and ocean currents that rivals modern navigation. And they didn't develop this knowledge on small, isolated islands. They brought it with them from somewhere else, somewhere that had the resources and stability to support the lengthy observations and record-keeping required to build such a comprehensive system. Or consider the Non-Madol complex in Micronesia, an artificial archipelago of 92 artificial islets built from massive basalt columns stacked like logs to create walls and platforms and structures. Some estimates suggest the total weight of stone used exceeds 750,000 tons, all of it quarried and transported and precisely placed without metal tools or written plans. And radiocarbon dating puts construction between 1200 and 1500 AD. But the Pohnpeian oral tradition says the site is much older, that it was built by the Saudeleur dynasty using magical means, and that before the Saudeleur, there was an even earlier civilization that understood the secret of making stone light, so it could be moved effortlessly. The same pattern repeats across the Pacific: megalithic platforms in Tonga, stone structures in the Marquesas, mysterious ruins in the Solomon Islands, each one accompanied by local traditions of earlier peoples who possessed greater knowledge, who came from lands to the east or west that no longer exist. And while mainstream archaeology explains these as independent developments by arriving Polynesian settlers, the similarities in construction technique, and astronomical alignment suggest either extensive contact between supposedly isolated islands or inheritance from a common source. And here's where it gets interesting, where the Mu hypothesis connects to everything else we've been exploring. The timeline for when these Pacific structures were supposedly built coincides roughly with the period after the Younger Dryas, after the Great Melting, after sea levels rose by 350 to 400 feet as the Ice Age glaciers turned to water. And if you were living on low-lying Pacific islands or coastal areas during this period, you would have watched your world slowly but inexorably shrink as the ocean claimed valleys and plains and eventually entire islands, forcing migration, disrupting trade networks, drowning cities and farmland, and forcing populations to concentrate on ever smaller patches of high ground. Imagine being part of a thriving maritime civilization spread across what is now the Pacific seafloor, when sea levels were 300 feet lower. Imagine having cities on coastal plains that stretched for miles beyond the current shoreline. Imagine trade routes between islands that are now completely submerged. Imagine astronomical observatories and ports and agricultural centers that disappeared beneath the waves over the course of a few centuries as the ice melted and the water rose relentlessly. And imagine the survivors of this slow-motion catastrophe clinging to the highest ground, to the peaks that became islands, bringing with them whatever knowledge and skills they could preserve, building monuments to remember what was lost, facing their statues toward the drowned lands, because forgetting would mean the final death of everything they'd been. This is Mu, not as a literal continent that sank in a day like Atlantis, but as a cultural memory of a lost world. A Pacific civilization that existed when the geography was different, when there was more land and different coastlines and island chains that no longer break the surface, and the survivors scattered to the remaining islands brought pieces of the old knowledge, built smaller versions of the old monuments, passed down stories that got mixed with later events until it became impossible to separate historical memory from mythological embellishment. But the core truth remained. There was something before, something greater, something the ocean took away. You climb to higher ground above the Moai platforms and look out across the Pacific, trying to imagine it as it was 15,000 years ago, when sea levels were lower and this island was part of a larger landmass, or when 10,000 years ago the water was rising and people living on coastal areas could watch the change happening within a single lifetime, the ocean claiming a little more territory each year. And you understand why they built monuments, why they invested so much effort in creating something permanent that would outlast the water. Because when everything else is being swallowed, the stone becomes your legacy, becomes your testimony that you existed, that you knew things, that you mattered. The academic debate about Mu has largely been settled in favor of skepticism. There's no geological evidence for a continent in the Pacific that sank within human memory. Plate tectonics doesn't allow for it. But that doesn't mean the stories are entirely false. It just means we might be interpreting them too literally, looking for a massive landmass when we should be looking for coastal civilizations and island nations that did indeed vanish beneath the waves as sea levels rose, looking for the cultural and genetic connections between Pacific peoples that suggest common origin, looking at the megalithic structures scattered across the ocean as breadcrumbs marking the path of migration and memory. And here's what keeps the Mu hypothesis alive despite academic dismissal. The Pacific is vast and largely unexplored beneath the waves. We have better maps of Mars than we do of the ocean floor, and every few years someone finds something unexpected. A submerged structure off the coast of Japan at Yonaguni that looks either like a natural formation or a carved pyramid, depending on who's examining it. Acoustic anomalies suggesting geometric patterns on the seafloor near various islands. And each discovery opens the possibility that there's more down there waiting to be found, more evidence of the world that drowned. You sit among the Moai as the sun begins its descent toward the horizon, and you think about the people who carved these giants, about the knowledge and organization required, about the stories they told their children of the homeland across the water, and whether those stories were literal history or cultural mythology seems less important than what they represent, which is humanity's need to remember, to mark our passage through time, to leave something that says we were here, even when the world we built is gone. The Mu hypothesis in its original form might be disproven, but the pattern it points to remains valid. Across the Pacific, you find evidence of sophisticated cultures that existed earlier than mainstream timelines comfortably accommodate. You find construction techniques and astronomical knowledge and navigation skills that suggest accumulated learning over many generations. You find oral traditions of drowned lands and departed ancestors, and golden ages that ended in catastrophe. And you find islands that sit atop seamounts and ridges that were indeed above water when sea levels were lower, that would have supported vegetation and animal life and human settlement before the rising ocean turned them into rocky pinnacles. And this connects to our larger investigation, because if Pacific Island cultures preserve memory of drowned lands, if their monuments face lost homelands, if their navigation knowledge comes from a time when the ocean was a different shape, then they're adding their testimony to the global chorus of flood myths and geological evidence and impossible structures. They're confirming that the world changed, that civilizations were lost, that knowledge was preserved in fragments by survivors who tried their best to rebuild and remember and pass forward what they could. The sun touches the horizon now, painting the Moai in shades of gold and crimson, and the stone faces watch with their eternal sadness as another day ends, and the ocean continues its patient work of keeping secrets. And you wonder what those faces would say if they could speak, what memories are encoded in their forms, what knowledge their builders tried to preserve in stone, because stone outlasts everything else. Stone survives when wood rots and fabric disintegrates, and even metal corrodes away. Stone remains to testify long after the people who shaped it have turned to dust. But stone has its limitations too. It can tell us shapes and weights and positions. It can show us technique and effort, but it can't tell us why. It can't explain the driving purpose behind its creation, and for that we need something different. We need to dive beneath the waves, where the real evidence might be waiting, where cities and roads and harbors sit in the cold darkness at depths that tell us precisely when they were submerged, giving us dates we can measure and timelines we can verify. And that's where we're going next, down into the blue mystery where the ocean keeps its secrets and megalithic ruins wait for light that hasn't reached them in 10,000 years. You take one last look at the Moai, at these stone watchers standing guard over memories of a drowned world, and you feel the weight of connection. Because whether Mu was a continent or a collection of islands, or simply a metaphor for the world before the floods, the people who carved these statues were trying to tell us something. They were marking their pain and their loss and their determination to be remembered. And in that, they succeeded. Because here you are, thousands of years later, standing among their monuments and asking the same questions they asked. Where did we come from? What did we lose? Will we forget again when the next catastrophe comes? The path leads downward now, beneath the surface, into water that covers cities and secrets. And if you thought the megalithic structures on land were impressive, wait until you see what's been hiding underwater. Wait until you understand how much of our past is still submerged, waiting for technology to catch up with curiosity. The descent continues, and the pressure builds, and soon you'll walk streets that haven't seen sunlight in 100 centuries. Let's follow the water to where it took the world. Chapter 5. Cities Beneath the Waves. You're in a small research vessel floating above the Gulf of Cambay off the western coast of India, the water beneath you stretching down 120 feet to a seafloor that holds something impossible. Something that shouldn't exist according to every timeline you've been taught. And on the sonar screen in front of you, geometric patterns emerge from the digital noise, straight lines and right angles and grid layouts that nature doesn't create. That can only mean one thing. human construction. Streets and buildings and walls arranged in organized blocks stretching for miles across the ocean floor. And when the technician adjusts the resolution, you can see individual structures, foundations that suggest buildings, channels that look like roads, a city plan as sophisticated as anything from the ancient world, except this city is sitting at a depth that tells you exactly when it was last above water. And the math is simple and terrifying. Sea levels were this low between 9 and 10,000 years ago, which means if this is a city, then it predates Sumerian civilization by 4,000 years, predates the Egyptian dynasties by 5,000 years, predates everything we think of as the beginning of urban culture by a margin that breaks the historical narrative completely. The discovery happened almost by accident in 2001, when the National Institute of Ocean Technology was conducting routine pollution surveys, and their side-scan sonar picked up anomalies, patterns too regular to be natural geological formations. And when they brought in marine archaeologists to investigate, the team spent months mapping what appeared to be a massive urban complex covering nearly 5 square miles of seafloor, with structures laid out in a grid pattern suggesting city planning, suggesting administration and organization, and a level of social complexity that wasn't supposed to exist in 7500 BC, when this area would have been dry land before the post-Ice Age seas rose and swallowed it. You watch as the remotely operated vehicle descends through layers of water that get progressively darker and colder, its lights cutting through the murk like knives. And when it reaches the bottom, you see what the sonar has been showing you. Stone structures emerging from the silt. Walls built from blocks that have been shaped and fitted together. Not the rough piling of rocks you'd expect from a natural formation, but deliberate construction. And scattered among the ruins are artifacts, pottery fragments, and what appear to be carved pieces of wood that the ROV carefully collects for carbon dating. And when those results come back weeks later, they confirm what the depth already suggested. 9,500 years old, give or take a few centuries, which places this settlement firmly in a period when mainstream archaeology insists humans were still nomadic hunter-gatherers, still thousands of years away from building permanent cities. But here's what makes your hands shake as you steady yourself against the rolling deck. This isn't the only drowned city. It's just one of several that have been found in recent decades, each one sitting at depths that correspond to ancient coastlines, each one featuring construction that seems too advanced for its supposed age. And when you map them all together, a pattern emerges that suggests these weren't isolated settlements, but potentially nodes in a maritime trading network that spanned the ancient world before the seas rose and broke the connections and isolated the survivors on scattered patches of high ground. Consider Yonaguni off the coast of Japan, where in 1987 a dive tour operator discovered massive stone structures at depths between 15 and 100 feet, featuring what look like platforms and stairs and channels carved into solid bedrock. And the formations include right angles and flat surfaces and terraced levels that would require incredible effort to create naturally through erosion. And marine geologist Masaaki Kimura has spent decades studying the site and concluded that while some features may be natural, others show clear evidence of human modification, tool marks and carved symbols, and alignment with solar positions that suggest astronomical knowledge and purpose. The Yonaguni structures sit at a depth indicating they were last above water around 10,000 years ago. And while mainstream archaeology dismisses them as natural geology shaped by currents and tectonic activity, the counter-argument is simple. If you found similar formations on dry land, everyone would recognize them as ruins, as evidence of architecture and planning. But because they're underwater, and because accepting them as artificial would require rewriting prehistory, the default position becomes skepticism, becomes demanding extraordinary proof for what should be an ordinary archaeological site. Or look at Dwarka off the coast of Gujarat in India, where underwater excavations have revealed walls and pillars and streets in multiple layers, suggesting the city was built and rebuilt several times as sea levels changed. And this aligns perfectly with Hindu texts that describe Dwarka as the legendary city of Krishna, a magnificent metropolis that was swallowed by the ocean after Krishna's death. And while mythology places this in a timeless past, the archaeology suggests the legends might preserve memory of a real city that was indeed lost to rising waters. And carbon dating of artifacts from the site ranges from 7500 BC to 1500 BC, indicating occupation over thousands of years, with the oldest levels now sitting in 70 feet of water. You lean over the railing as the ROV surfaces with its collection of samples from the Cambay site, pieces of worked wood and pottery shards and stones that show signs of being shaped by tools, each one a fragment of testimony that someone lived here, built here, created a society complex enough to produce ceramics and construct permanent structures. And all of it now rests in darkness, beneath waves that keep perfect records of when they arrived. Because unlike stone monuments on land, which can be difficult to date precisely, drowned cities come with built-in chronology. The depth tells you when they went underwater, and that timeline is fixed by global sea level curves derived from ice cores and ocean sediments and coral reef growth patterns. The sea level story is straightforward physics. During the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, so much water was locked up in ice sheets that ocean levels were 350 to 400 feet lower than today, exposing vast areas of continental shelf as dry land. The English Channel was a river valley. The Persian Gulf was a fertile plain. Indonesia was connected to mainland Asia by a land bridge. And all around the world, coastlines extended far beyond their current positions. And this extra land wasn't barren, ice-covered tundra. In many places, it had temperate climates and river systems and everything needed to support human settlement. Then came the Great Melting, triggered by whatever combination of factors caused the younger Dryas warming around 11,600 years ago. Possibly the comet impacts that Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock argue for. Possibly cyclical changes in Earth's orbit and axial tilt. Possibly a combination of factors we don't fully understand. But whatever the cause, the ice sheets began collapsing, and billions of tons of fresh water poured into the oceans, and sea levels rose not gradually over tens of thousands of years, but in pulses, in rapid jumps separated by periods of stability. And during the most dramatic pulses, levels could rise several feet per decade, fast enough that a person living on a coastal plain could watch the ocean claim more territory each year, could see villages and fields and sacred sites disappear beneath the advancing water. Imagine living through that. Imagine your great-grandparents telling stories of when the ocean was a day's walk away, and now it's lapping at the edges of your settlement. Imagine watching the fishing grounds move as the water rises, watching islands become smaller, watching the land bridge to the neighboring territory slowly submerge until it becomes impassable. Imagine the social disruption as populations are forced to migrate inland, as communities are split apart, as trade routes are broken and resources become scarce, and conflicts arise over the shrinking habitable land. And through all of this, you're trying to preserve knowledge, trying to maintain the technological and cultural achievements your civilization developed when times were better. But it's getting harder as libraries flood and craftsmen die, and the focus shifts from advancement to simple survival. The ROV goes down again, this time equipped with better cameras and sampling tools, and you watch the live feed as it explores what appears to be a street, a corridor between two parallel walls running straight for dozens of meters before disappearing under a sand drift. And along this street are depressions that might be building foundations, regular rectangular shapes spaced in a pattern that suggests urban planning. And the pilot maneuvers carefully around these features, documenting everything. Because despite the sonar mapping, there's still controversy about Cambay. Still academics who insist these are natural formations misidentified by wishful thinking. And every piece of evidence has to be meticulously recorded and defended against critics who have careers invested in the existing timeline. Here's what the critics don't want to acknowledge: that rising sea levels would have preferentially destroyed evidence of coastal civilizations because that's where cities naturally develop, at harbors and river mouths, and protected bays where trade and fishing and transportation converge. And if there was an advanced maritime culture during the period from 15,000 to 8,000 years ago, all their major population centers would now be underwater, would be sitting on the continental shelf beneath hundreds of feet of ocean. And we've explored less than 5% of the seafloor in any detail, which means 95% of potential evidence remains hidden in darkness, waiting for technology and funding and academic willingness to go looking for it. Think about the implications if even one of these underwater sites is confirmed as a genuine city from 7500 BC or earlier. If the evidence becomes overwhelming enough that mainstream archaeology has to accept it, suddenly you have urban civilization, city planning, architecture, social organization, pottery production, and potentially metallurgy and writing, existing thousands of years before they're supposed to. And that doesn't just add a footnote to history. It requires completely rewriting the story of human development. It opens questions about what else might have existed and been lost. What knowledge might have been developed and forgotten? What other cities might be waiting in the deep? You think about Heraklion and Canopus, Egyptian cities that were found submerged in the Mediterranean in 2000 after being lost for over 1,000 years. And those cities sank due to earthquakes and subsidence relatively recently in historical terms. But they demonstrate how completely urban centers can disappear, how thoroughly water can hide evidence until modern sonar and diving technology make it possible to search systematically. And if cities from 1000 BC can vanish so completely, how many older settlements have been swallowed and forgotten? The ancient Mediterranean coastline was very different when sea levels were lower. Places we think of as islands were connected to mainland. Channels we think of as ancient were dry land, and entire cultures may have existed on plains that are now underwater. And around the world, the story repeats. Off the coast of Cuba, there are sonar images of what appear to be megalithic structures at depths of 2,000 feet, suggesting either they're natural formations or they're incredibly ancient, because that depth corresponds to sea levels from 50,000 years ago or more, which seems impossible, but the images exist, showing linear patterns and right angles at depths where sediment should have buried everything. And mainstream science hasn't adequately investigated because accepting those structures as artificial would require accepting human civilization at timescales that contradict everything about human evolution and development. You watch the sun descend toward the horizon, painting the Gulf of Cambay in shades of copper and gold. And beneath this beautiful surface lies a city that was old when the pyramids were young, that thrived and grew and eventually drowned as the world changed around it, and its people either died or fled to higher ground, carrying whatever they could save. And maybe those refugees integrated into other communities and brought their knowledge with them, their understanding of astronomy and mathematics and construction. And maybe that's why you find sudden jumps in sophistication in the archaeological record. Not because people spontaneously invented complex ideas, but because survivors from drowned cities brought those ideas with them and taught them to inland populations who had been isolated from the coastal culture. This could explain Gobekli Tepe being built with full sophistication around 9600 BC, could explain the sudden appearance of agriculture and animal domestication in multiple locations around the same time, could explain why Sumerian civilization seems to spring into existence already mature with writing and mathematics and astronomy and monumental architecture around 4000 BC. Maybe they weren't starting from scratch. Maybe they were rebuilding, remembering, recovering fragments of knowledge that had existed before the floods and been partially preserved by survivors. The evidence is fragmentary, but it's accumulating. Side-scan sonar keeps finding anomalies in shallow seas around the world. Underwater archaeologists keep pushing for funding to investigate these sites properly. Geologists keep discovering that coastlines and sea levels have changed more dramatically and more recently than we assumed. And oral traditions from coastal peoples around the world keep talking about drowned lands and lost cities and ancestors who came from beneath the waves. And at some point you have to ask, when does the pattern of evidence become too consistent to dismiss? When does skepticism become denial? You make one final notation in the research log as the vessel turns toward port, documenting the coordinates of features that deserve more investigation, and you know that years of work lie ahead. Years of fighting for funding and academic acceptance, and against critics who will find every possible alternative explanation before accepting that human civilization might be older and stranger than we've been taught. But the city is down there waiting patiently in the cold and the dark, and eventually the truth emerges. Stone and pottery don't lie. Depth measurements don't lie. Carbon dates don't lie. And reality has a way of asserting itself, no matter how inconvenient it might be for established narratives. And here's the question that follows you back to shore. If cities like Cambay and Dwarka and Yonaguni represent the visible tip of a much larger submerged world, if there are dozens or hundreds of similar sites waiting to be found on continental shelves around the globe, then what kind of civilization existed before the waters rose? How widespread was it? How advanced was it? What did they know that we've had to rediscover? And most importantly, what happened to their knowledge? Because the stones suggest sophistication, but stones can't preserve everything, can't preserve libraries or scientific instruments or philosophical texts. And if there was advanced knowledge in the pre-flood world, it would have been lost when the cities drowned, unless someone deliberately tried to save it, to encode it in monuments or myths or sacred traditions that could survive the catastrophe. That's where we're going next, into the question of knowledge itself, into ancient texts and artifacts that suggest someone knew things they shouldn't have known, that contain information about astronomy and mathematics and geography that wouldn't be rediscovered for thousands of years. And we'll explore the possibility that post-flood civilizations weren't inventing but recovering, weren't discovering but remembering, and that many of the achievements we credit to Babylon or Egypt or Greece might actually be echoes of something older, fragments of understanding that existed before the world changed and were preserved by survivors who understood that knowledge is the most valuable cargo you can carry when everything else is lost to the waters. Chapter 6. The Knowledge That Survived. You're standing inside the Great Pyramid of Giza in the King's Chamber, the granite walls rising around you in perfect vertical alignment, and you're looking at something that shouldn't be possible given the official timeline. The room is oriented to true north, with an accuracy of 3/60ths of a single degree, which is remarkable enough. But the real mystery is encoded in the pyramid's dimensions themselves, in ratios and measurements that contain mathematical constants the Egyptians supposedly didn't know. And as you run your hand along the cool stone, you're touching evidence that someone understood advanced mathematics thousands of years before those concepts were allegedly discovered. And the question that echoes in this ancient space is not who built this, but what did they know, and where did that knowledge come from? The numbers are undeniable, and they've been verified by countless surveys over the past 2 centuries. The Great Pyramid's height of 481 feet multiplied by 2 times pi gives you the perimeter of the base with extraordinary accuracy, which means the ratio of height to base perimeter is the same as the ratio of a circle's radius to its circumference. And this could be coincidence, except the number pi appears again in other relationships throughout the structure, in the slope angle of the faces, in the proportions of the chambers, in measurements that seem deliberately designed to encode this mathematical constant. But according to conventional history, pi wasn't accurately calculated until the Greeks did it, around 250 BC, roughly 2,000 years after the pyramid was built. And it's not just pi. The pyramid also encodes phi, the golden ratio of 1.618, in the relationship between the slant height and half the base length. And phi is supposed to have been discovered by the Greeks as well, particularly by Euclid, around 300 BC. Yet here it is, built into a structure from 2560 BC. And some researchers argue these ratios are unintentional, that the Egyptians were just following aesthetic principles that happened to approximate these constants. But that explanation becomes harder to maintain when you look at the precision involved, when you see how many different measurements all converge on the same mathematical relationships. When you understand that achieving this level of accuracy requires not luck, but knowledge, not accident, but intention. You walk to the center of the chamber and look up at the corbelled ceiling, each massive granite block placed with such precision that the joints are nearly invisible, and you think about what it takes to create a structure this exact, the surveying knowledge required to establish the cardinal directions before GPS or magnetic compasses, the engineering understanding needed to design a building that would remain stable for 4,500 years despite earthquakes and subsidence, the organizational capacity to quarry and transport and position 2.3 million stone blocks averaging 2.5 tons each, with some weighing over 50 tons. And every explanation you've been given for how this was accomplished with copper tools and wooden sledges and unlimited human labor feels inadequate when you're actually standing here surrounded by the evidence of their achievement. But here's where it gets stranger. Here's where the conventional narrative starts to fracture under the weight of what the stones are telling us. The Great Pyramid isn't oriented to the current North Pole. It's oriented to true north, as it was in 2560 BC, accounting for the precession of the equinoxes, which means the builders understood that the Earth's axis wobbles over a cycle of roughly 26,000 years, and they knew the exact rate of this precession and could calculate backwards or forwards to determine where true north would be at any given time. And this is supposed to be knowledge that wasn't rediscovered until Hipparchus figured it out around 150 BC. Yet the pyramid demonstrates it was known and applied over 2,000 years earlier. The mystery deepens when you examine the Dendera zodiac from the Temple of Hathor, a ceiling carving that shows the constellations in positions suggesting it's mapping the sky from around 10,500 BC, not the time when the temple was built, but thousands of years earlier, as if the Egyptians were preserving knowledge of celestial positions from a much older period. And the same pattern appears at other sites, astronomical alignments that seem to commemorate or point to dates far earlier than the conventional chronology allows. And you have to ask where this knowledge came from. How did a civilization that supposedly emerged around 3100 BC possess detailed understanding of precession and stellar positions from 10,500 BC unless they inherited it from someone who was watching and recording the sky during that earlier period? You exit the pyramid and walk toward the Sphinx, that enigmatic monument with the body of a lion and the face that might not be original, that might have been recarved in dynastic times from an earlier form. And geologist Robert Schoch has argued, based on erosion patterns, that the Sphinx enclosure shows evidence of sustained rainfall over long periods, the kind of weathering that requires centuries of exposure to water. But Egypt has been arid for the past 5,000 years. You'd need to go back to before 7000 BC to find a climate wet enough to produce this erosion, which would make the Sphinx at least 9,000 years old, predating dynastic Egypt by thousands of years and suggesting it was built by whoever came before, by the same culture that might have left knowledge of precession and advanced mathematics for the later Egyptians to inherit and incorporate into their own monuments. The evidence of inherited knowledge isn't limited to Egypt. Look at the Sumerian king list, which describes rulers who reigned for impossibly long periods before a great flood. And after the flood, the dynasties continue, but with more reasonable reign lengths. And while mainstream scholars dismiss the pre-flood section as mythology, what if it's compressed history? What if it's preserving memory of a time when civilization was already ancient, when kingdoms rose and fell over periods that seem impossibly long because they're being measured in a different way, or because the survivors who passed down the tradition didn't have precise chronology and just knew that the old world lasted for ages before the water came. The Sumerians appear in the historical record around 4000 BC, already possessing writing, mathematics, astronomy, complex theology, monumental architecture, and sophisticated legal systems. They don't show the gradual development you'd expect from a culture inventing these things. They arrive on the scene with all the pieces already in place, and their own texts credit their knowledge to the Apkallu, the 7 sages who came before the flood and taught humanity the arts of civilization. And whether you interpret these sages as actual historical figures or as metaphors for inherited knowledge from an earlier culture, the pattern is the same. The Sumerians believed they were recovering and building upon wisdom that predated their civilization. Consider the Antikythera mechanism, that impossibly sophisticated device recovered from a Roman-era shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901. A bronze mechanism with dozens of precisely cut gears that functioned as an astronomical calculator, capable of predicting the positions of the sun and moon and planets with remarkable accuracy. And when it was built around 100 BC, it represented a level of mechanical sophistication that wouldn't be matched again until medieval clockmakers thousands of years later. And the obvious question is, where did the knowledge to build this come from? Because you don't create something this complex as a first attempt. There must have been earlier versions, simpler prototypes, a whole tradition of mechanical device making that we have no record of. And what if that tradition stretched back further than we think? What if the Antikythera mechanism is actually a degraded copy of something more sophisticated, an attempt to recreate lost technology using whatever understanding remained? Or examine the Piri-Reis map from 1513, a chart drawn by an Ottoman admiral that shows the coast of South America and Antarctica with details that shouldn't be possible, because the map shows Antarctica without ice, showing the coastline as it would appear if the ice sheet wasn't there. And the ice has covered Antarctica for millions of years, according to conventional geology. Except recent research suggests parts of the continent might have been ice-free as recently as 6,000 years ago, during a period of warmer global temperatures. But even that doesn't explain how anyone from 1513 would have accurate maps of these coastlines. And Piri-Reis himself notes in the margins that he compiled his map from older source maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great or earlier, which suggests there was once a tradition of map-making and maritime exploration sophisticated enough to chart continents accurately. And that tradition was lost, and only fragments survived in various archives for Ottoman cartographers to find and copy. You sit on a stone block in the shadow of the Sphinx and watch tourists stream past taking photographs, unaware they're looking at possibly the oldest structure on Earth, unaware that the face gazing eastward might have watched the stars when Orion was in a completely different position in the sky. And you think about what it means that ancient civilizations possessed knowledge they weren't supposed to have. Knowledge of mathematics and astronomy and geography and engineering that the conventional timeline says wasn't developed until much later. And the only explanations that make sense are either that humans are far more capable than we give our ancestors credit for, and independently discovered these concepts multiple times in multiple places, or that there was an earlier source, an older civilization that had already done the discovering and left records or traditions or structures that encoded their knowledge for later cultures to inherit. The pattern repeats globally. In China, the ancient astronomers knew the length of the solar year to an accuracy that rivals modern calculations. They tracked planetary movements and eclipse cycles with precision that required generations of continuous observation. And their records claim this knowledge goes back to the mythical Yellow Emperor in 2600 BC or earlier. And whether that's literal history or not, it indicates an understanding that they were inheriting astronomical knowledge from deep antiquity. In India, the Vedic texts contain descriptions of vast cycles of time and cosmic processes that seem almost to anticipate modern cosmology. They speak of the universe expanding and contracting over billions of years. They describe units of time so large they make geological ages look brief. And while you can argue this is coincidence or poetic imagination, there's also embedded mathematical and astronomical knowledge in these texts, references to the precession of the equinoxes, accurate values for the speed of light encoded in the measurements of ritual altars, and knowledge of planetary orbits and stellar distances that wouldn't be confirmed by modern science until we had telescopes. The Baghdad battery, discovered in 1936 near Baghdad, shows that someone in Mesopotamia around 200 BC, or possibly much earlier, understood electrochemical principles well enough to create what appears to be a primitive galvanic cell, a clay jar with copper cylinder and iron rod that when filled with acidic liquid could generate electric current. And mainstream archaeology dismisses this as a curiosity, possibly used for electroplating gold. But it demonstrates knowledge of electrical principles that aren't supposed to exist until the 1800s. And what if this too is a remnant, a simplified version of more sophisticated electrical understanding that existed in the past and was mostly lost, with only fragments surviving to puzzle later civilizations? You watch the sun descend toward the horizon, turning the Giza Plateau into a landscape of long shadows and golden stone. And you understand that knowledge is fragile, that it can be lost more easily than monuments, because libraries burn and scholars die, and traditions get interrupted by catastrophe. And if a global civilization was indeed disrupted by the Younger Dryas event 12,000 years ago, if cities drowned and populations scattered, and the survivors spent generations just trying to stay alive, then most of the accumulated knowledge would have been lost. Most of the books and instruments and detailed records would have vanished. But some fragments would survive. Oral traditions passed down, building techniques remembered, astronomical observations recorded in monuments because stone lasts when paper and wood and metal all decay. And this explains the strange pattern we see in ancient civilizations. They appear already mature, already possessing sophisticated knowledge, not because they developed it impossibly quickly, but because they were recovering it. They were rebuilding based on fragments and memories inherited from survivors of the older world. And the knowledge wasn't evenly preserved. Some civilizations got more pieces than others. Some inherited advanced astronomy, while others got advanced mathematics or engineering. And over time, they developed these seeds of knowledge in their own directions, adding their own discoveries while never quite matching the integrated understanding that might have existed before the catastrophe. Think about the Library of Alexandria. How much knowledge was lost when it burned? How many ancient texts and scientific treatises and philosophical works existed in only one copy and vanished forever? And that was just one library destroyed in historical times when we had multiple centers of learning and writing was common. Imagine how much more devastating the knowledge loss would be if catastrophe struck a civilization before they had developed widespread literacy. If most knowledge existed in the minds of specialists and in perishable records, you could lose 99% of everything they knew, with only scattered fragments surviving in oral tradition and in monuments built to encode essential information in stone. The Great Pyramid might be one of those monuments, a structure designed not just as a tomb, but as a library, encoding in its dimensions and proportions and alignments the mathematical and astronomical knowledge that couldn't be preserved any other way. Built to last millennia, because the builders knew from experience that civilizations fall and knowledge gets lost. And the only way to send a message to the distant future is to carve it in stone on a scale so massive it can't be ignored. And maybe that's why we find the same constants appearing in megalithic structures around the world. Not because of some magical global network, but because survivors from a common source culture scattered to different regions and each built their own version of the knowledge repository. Each encoded what they could remember of the old wisdom in the dimensions and alignments of their monuments. You stand and begin walking back toward the pyramid as the light fades, and you carry with you a new understanding of what these ancient structures represent. They're not just impressive architectural achievements, they're messages, they're time capsules. They're the desperate effort of people who knew the world was ending to preserve something for whoever came after. And we're the ones who came after. We're the descendants of survivors, trying to decode what our ancestors tried so hard to save. And every time we discover a new mathematical relationship in the pyramid's dimensions, or a new astronomical alignment in a temple's orientation, we're recovering another fragment of the knowledge that almost died when the floods came. And here's the final question that stays with you as darkness settles over Giza and the pyramids become silhouettes against the stars. If so much knowledge was lost 12,000 years ago, and we've spent the entire span of recorded history slowly recovering fragments of it, piecing together understanding that existed before in more complete form, then what happens when the next catastrophe comes? What happens when the next great disruption hits our civilization? Will we be wise enough to encode our knowledge in forms that will survive? Will we build our own pyramids to carry our understanding forward? Or will we trust it all to digital storage and cloud servers and electronic media that will all fail when the power goes out, and leave our descendants in darkness, wondering what we knew and how we knew it? The answer matters, because the pattern suggests catastrophes are cyclical, that the earth has rhythms and humanity has risen and fallen multiple times. And the question isn't if it will happen again, but when, and whether we'll be ready. Whether we'll have learned from the stones and the drowned cities and the inherited knowledge that civilization is precious and fragile and worth preserving at any cost. Even if that cost is building monuments so massive they dwarf everything else we create. Monuments that will still be standing when everything else we've made has crumbled to dust. Chapter 7. The pattern repeats. You're standing at the edge of a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean as storm clouds gather on the horizon, the wind carrying salt spray and the smell of approaching rain. And you're thinking about cycles, about how the earth breathes in patterns measured not in human lifetimes, but in thousands of years. Ice advancing and retreating, seas rising and falling, climates shifting from wet to dry and back again. And somewhere in these vast rhythms, human civilizations rise and build and forget and fall. And the question that haunts you as you watch the dark water is whether we're smart enough to break the cycle, or doomed to repeat it like everyone who came before. The evidence we've walked through together tells a story that conventional history refuses to acknowledge. It says that 12,000 years ago, during the younger Dryas period, something catastrophic happened. Whether it was comet impacts or massive volcanic eruptions, or some combination of factors we don't fully understand, the result was the same. Rapid climate change, collapsing ice sheets, megafloods that carved new valleys through bedrock, sea levels rising hundreds of feet and drowning coastal civilizations, and a global catastrophe that reset human development back to nearly zero, scattering survivors who carried fragments of the old knowledge to high ground where they tried to rebuild with whatever they could remember. We've seen the geological scars in the channeled Scablands, where water moving faster than modern rivers carved channels hundreds of feet deep through solid basalt. We've touched stones at Gobekli Tepe and Baalbek and Pumapunku, that were shaped and moved with techniques we can't replicate even with modern equipment. We've looked at sonar images of drowned cities sitting at depths that tell us precisely when they were submerged. And we've examined the mathematical and astronomical knowledge encoded in monuments like the Great Pyramid. Knowledge that supposedly didn't exist when these structures were built. And every piece of evidence points the same direction, toward a conclusion that makes mainstream academics uncomfortable, but that the stones and the water and the ancient texts all confirm. We are not the first advanced civilization on this planet. We are not the first to develop mathematics and astronomy and engineering and writing. We are the inheritors, the descendants of survivors, the children of a world that drowned. And here's what keeps you awake at night, once you understand this pattern. Here's what makes your hands shake as you grip the cliff edge and watch the storm approach. The cycle isn't over. The earth hasn't stopped breathing. The forces that caused catastrophe 12,000 years ago are still operating. Ice still accumulates at the poles and periodically releases. Tectonic plates still shift and trigger earthquakes and tsunamis. Volcanic systems still build pressure and eventually explode. And our sun still sends out solar flares that can disrupt magnetic fields and induce currents in the ground. And comets and asteroids still cross Earth's orbit with trajectories we're only beginning to map comprehensively. And any of these factors alone, or in combination, could trigger another reset, another catastrophe that makes our current civilization join Gobekli Tepe and Cambay and all the other ruins as archaeological mysteries for whatever comes after us to puzzle over. Think about how fragile our knowledge infrastructure is, how much of what we know exists only in digital form, on servers that require constant electricity and maintenance, how our libraries have been converted to databases that will become instantly inaccessible if the power grid fails. How specialized knowledge exists only in the minds of experts who would die in a major catastrophe, along with everything they know. And imagine what happens if a Carrington event-level solar storm hits Earth and fries every electronic device simultaneously. Or if a supervolcano like Yellowstone erupts and drops global temperatures by putting ash into the stratosphere for years. Or if a comet fragment strikes the ocean and sends mega-tsunami racing across every coastline where most of our population centers are located. How much would survive? How much knowledge would the survivors be able to preserve as they fled inland and struggled to find food and shelter and rebuild some semblance of society? You'd lose the internet immediately, gone in a flash when the servers die and the data centers flood or burn. You'd lose most books because libraries are in cities that would be destroyed or abandoned. You'd lose the electrical grid and everything that depends on it, which is essentially all of modern infrastructure. You'd lose the supply chains that deliver food and medicine and fuel. You'd lose the social organization that maintains order and coordinates large-scale projects. And within a generation, you'd lose most of the specialized knowledge because the experts would be dead and their students would be too busy surviving to maintain the education systems. And what remains would be scattered survivors trying to remember how things worked, trying to pass down whatever fragments they could recall to children who never experienced the world before and have no context for understanding what was lost. This is what happened 12,000 years ago. This is why civilizations that came after, like Sumer and Egypt, appeared already possessing sophisticated knowledge. They were working from inherited fragments, rebuilding based on memories and techniques passed down by survivors who had seen the old world and tried desperately to preserve its wisdom. And the monuments they built weren't just expressions of religious devotion or political power. They were libraries in stone, attempts to encode essential knowledge in a form that would survive the next catastrophe, because they understood from bitter experience that catastrophes come and knowledge is lost. And the only way to send information across vast stretches of time is to carve it into something that can't burn or flood or decay. The Great Pyramid encodes pi and phi and the precession of the equinoxes, not because the Egyptians were showing off, but because someone wanted future civilizations to know that these constants had been discovered, that humanity had once understood these relationships, and if you're smart enough to measure the pyramid carefully, you'll find these encoded truths. And maybe you'll wonder how they got there. And maybe that wonder will lead you to ask the right questions about your own origins and the cycles of rise and fall that govern human history. You watch the storm clouds move closer, lightning flickering in their depths, and you think about the 200 flood myths we discussed earlier, how they all preserve the same basic story with the same elements: warning from the divine, a chosen survivor, a great vessel, animals saved in pairs, and a world that emerges afterward fundamentally changed. And what if these aren't myths at all, but history? What if they're humanity's way of remembering the catastrophe, of passing down the testimony of what happened when the water came? And the reason the story appears in every culture is because every culture had survivors. Every region of the world experienced the flooding and the climate chaos and the civilizational collapse. And in the aftermath, when populations were scattered and isolated, each group preserved their own version of the story, but the core remained the same, because the core was true. And if the flood myths are historical memory rather than religious allegory, then what about the other persistent myths? The stories of golden ages that came before, of times when gods walked among men and taught them the arts of civilization, of advanced beings who possessed technology that seemed like magic. What if these too are garbled memories of the pre-flood world, of a civilization that to traumatized survivors seemed impossibly advanced? And the gods were just people who understood engineering and astronomy and metallurgy at levels the survivors couldn't match anymore, because most of the knowledge had been lost, and over generations the memory got mythologized. The advanced humans became divine beings, their tools became magical artifacts, their cities became heavenly realms. But underneath the mythology, there's a kernel of historical truth about a world that existed and was lost. The archaeological establishment resists these ideas because accepting them would mean rewriting textbooks and reconsidering careers' worth of research, and admitting that indigenous oral traditions might preserve accurate information about events from 10,000 years ago, which challenges the assumption that non-literate cultures can't maintain historical accuracy across such time spans. But the evidence keeps mounting. The drowned cities keep being found. The impossible monuments keep defying explanation. The encoded knowledge keeps appearing in structures that predate its supposed discovery. And at some point, the weight of evidence becomes too heavy to ignore, and the paradigm has to shift. Even if it shifts reluctantly, and with extensive face-saving qualifications from academics who spent decades defending the old model. You turn away from the ocean and begin walking back toward civilization, toward the cities and roads and power lines that seem so permanent, but are actually as fragile as morning dew. And you carry with you the understanding that everything we've built could vanish in a generation if the right catastrophe hits. That our skyscrapers and highways and data centers could become as mysterious to future archaeologists as Gobekli Tepe and Pumapunku are to us. And those future researchers might stand in the ruins of New York or Tokyo or London and debate whether the structures were natural formations or evidence of intelligent construction. Whether the previous inhabitants really had the technology to build such things, or whether we're overinterpreting the remains. And they might dismiss the stories their elders tell about the world before as myths and superstition, just as we've dismissed the flood myths and the accounts of golden ages. And the cycle continues. Rise and fall. Remember and forget. Build and destroy. But here's the difference. Here's the slim hope that maybe this time we can break the pattern. We know about the cycle now, We've decoded enough of the message in the stones to understand that this has happened before, that civilizations have risen and fallen, and that catastrophes are not random acts of divine punishment, but natural processes that follow patterns we can study and potentially predict. And we have technology that previous civilizations didn't have. We can track asteroids and comets. We can monitor volcanic activity and solar storms. We can build early warning systems for earthquakes and tsunamis. And theoretically, we could prepare. We could create knowledge repositories in hardened facilities. We could encode essential information in multiple formats, including physical books and stone monuments and satellite systems. We could establish seed banks and genetic libraries and technical manuals that would give survivors the tools to rebuild faster and preserve more. The question is whether we will. Whether we have the collective wisdom to take the threat seriously before catastrophe strikes, or whether we'll do what humans usually do, which is assume the good times will last forever, and invest our resources in immediate pleasures rather than long-term survival. Because preparing for civilizational collapse isn't politically popular, it doesn't win elections or generate profits, and it's easier to believe that technology will save us, or that catastrophes only happen to other people in other times. And so we build our cities on coastlines that will flood when sea levels rise. We concentrate our populations in earthquake zones and volcanic regions. We trust our entire knowledge base to electronic systems that could fail simultaneously. And we ignore the warnings from geology and astronomy and ancient texts, because heeding them would require sacrifice and planning and long-term thinking that our current systems aren't designed to support. You reach the parking lot as the first drops of rain begin to fall, and you sit in your car, watching water stream down the windshield. And you think about the people of Cambay watching the ocean rise, year after year, generation after generation, knowing their world was shrinking but perhaps not understanding that it would eventually be completely submerged. And you wonder if they tried to preserve their knowledge, if they carved their wisdom into stones and carried it to high ground, if they told their children and grandchildren about the cities and the learning and the achievements that were being swallowed by the advancing sea. And you wonder if some of their descendants are alive today, if their genetic legacy and cultural memory flows through modern populations, if somewhere in our collective unconscious we carry the trauma of that loss and the determination not to let it happen again. The storm breaks in earnest now, rain hammering on the roof, thunder rolling across the sky, and you understand that you're watching a small echo of the forces that can reshape the world. That weather and water and geological processes operate on scales that make human civilization look like a brief candle flame that could be snuffed out by the slightest cosmic breeze. But you also understand that knowledge is our advantage, that awareness of the cycle gives us a chance to prepare for it, and that the monuments and myths left by previous civilizations are not just archaeological curiosities, but warnings and guidebooks, messages from people who experienced catastrophe and tried to help whoever came after avoid the same fate, or at least survive it better. So, what do we do with this knowledge? What do we do with the understanding that we're living on borrowed time between catastrophes? That the peaceful, stable climate of the past 10,000 years is an anomaly rather than the norm? That the Earth's systems operate in cycles that periodically reset the surface and whatever civilization happens to be flourishing at the time? We could despair and give up. We could adopt a fatalistic attitude and say, it doesn't matter what we build because it will all be destroyed eventually. But that's not what previous civilizations did. They didn't give up. They built their pyramids and their temples. They encoded their knowledge and passed down their stories. They fought to preserve what they could, even knowing it might not be enough. And their efforts succeeded because we're here. We found their monuments. We decoded some of their messages. We're having this conversation because survivors 12,000 years ago refused to let everything die with them. The rain begins to ease, and breaks in the clouds let through shafts of golden light, and you start the car and begin driving home through streets that will be here tomorrow or next year, but might not survive the next century if the cycle turns. And you carry with you a responsibility now, the responsibility that comes with understanding, because you've seen the evidence. You've walked among the ruins and touched the stones and looked at the drowned cities. And you can't pretend anymore that history is a simple, linear progression from primitive to advanced. You know now that it's cyclical, that we've been here before, that the knowledge we're so proud of might be remembered rather than discovered, and that the catastrophes are coming again because they always come. The only questions are when, and whether we'll be ready. This is what the stones have been trying to tell us. This is the message encoded in monuments that outlasted empires. This is why flood myths appear in every culture, and why ancient texts speak of ages that came before, and golden times that were lost. They're not fantasies or religious allegories, they're warnings. They're testimony from survivors who watched their world end and wanted to make sure we understood that it could happen again, that it will happen again, and that our only hope is to preserve knowledge in forms that survive catastrophe, and to build with the understanding that what we create might need to last not just decades or centuries, but millennia. Long enough to carry our wisdom across the gap between one civilization and the next. The sun breaks through completely now, painting the wet streets in light that makes everything look new and clean, and you drive toward home with questions still echoing in your mind. Questions about what we should be doing differently, about whether we're wise enough to learn from the past or doomed to repeat it, about what monuments we should be building, and what knowledge we should be encoding, and whether any of it will matter when the Earth decides it's time for another reset. But even without answers, you feel changed by what you've learned. You see the world differently now. You understand that beneath the modern surface, there are layers of history we've barely begun to excavate. That the story of human civilization is longer and stranger and more fragile than we've been taught. And that the future depends on whether we can remember what the ancients tried so hard to help us understand. That everything ends, but knowledge can survive, if we fight hard enough to preserve it. You're back where we started, standing by the water's edge as night settles around you. But you're not the same person who began this journey hours ago. You've walked through time and touched stones that remember what we've forgotten. You've descended beneath waves that guard the secrets of drowned cities. You've stood in chambers where mathematics was encoded before it was supposedly discovered. And you've seen the pattern that connects it all. The rise and fall, the catastrophe and survival, the desperate effort to preserve knowledge across the gap between one world and the next. The evidence is overwhelming once you allow yourself to see it without the filters of conventional thinking. The channeled Scablands prove that megafloods carved continents in days rather than millions of years. Gobekli Tepe and Baalbek and Pumapunku demonstrate that sophisticated construction and astronomical knowledge existed thousands of years before the accepted timeline allows. The cities beneath the Gulf of Cambay and off the coasts of Japan and India confirm that urban civilization was thriving when mainstream history says we were still nomadic hunter-gatherers. And the Great Pyramid and the Dendera Zodiac and the Antikythera mechanism all testify that advanced mathematics and astronomy and engineering were known and lost, and partially recovered by cultures we think of as ancient, but who were themselves looking back at an even older world they could barely remember. The flood myths aren't myths, they're testimony. 200 cultures independently preserving the same story because they all experienced the same catastrophe. They all watched the waters rise and the old world drown, and the survivors scattered to high ground, carrying whatever fragments of knowledge they could save. And those fragments became the seeds of later civilizations, the mysterious inherited wisdom that let Sumerians appear with writing already developed, and Egyptians build pyramids that encoded mathematical constants they supposedly didn't know. Because they weren't starting from zero. They were rebuilding, remembering, recovering what had been lost when the world changed 12,000 years ago. And here's the truth that the silence has been hiding. Here's what the stones and the water and the ancient texts have been trying to tell us if we were willing to listen. We are not the first advanced civilization on this planet. We are not the first to look at the stars and decode their movements. We are not the first to quarry massive stones and arrange them in alignment with celestial events. We are not the first to build cities and develop writing and mathematics and metallurgy. We are the children of catastrophe, the descendants of survivors who watched everything they knew disappear beneath rising seas and tried desperately to pass forward whatever they could remember. And the monuments they left aren't primitive attempts at architecture by people who didn't know better. They're sophisticated time capsules, built by people who understood exactly what they were doing, who knew that stone survives when everything else fails, who encoded their most important knowledge in dimensions and proportions and alignments, because they had learned the hard way that catastrophes come and civilizations fall, and the only way to send a message across thousands of years is to make it too big to ignore and too precise to be accidental. So what do we do with this understanding? What changes now that we know the pattern? Now that we've seen the evidence that history is cyclical rather than linear? That the comfortable narrative of steady progress from caves to cities is a simplification that ignores the peaks and valleys, the rises and resets, the civilizations that came before and left only fragments for us to puzzle over. We could feel despair at the fragility of everything we've built, at the realization that our cities and our knowledge and our achievements could vanish in a single catastrophe, just as completely as Cambay and Gobekli Tepe vanished. But despair isn't what the ancients would want from us. They didn't build their monuments to make us give up. They built them to show us what's possible, to prove that knowledge can survive if we're determined enough to preserve it, to demonstrate that even after the world ends, there can be a new beginning if the survivors remember enough to rebuild. Or we could feel wonder at the resilience of human knowledge, at the fact that mathematical constants discovered 10,000 years ago still appear in monuments today, that astronomical observations made before the pyramids were built still align with celestial events we can measure, that techniques for moving massive stones and creating acoustic resonance in chambers and encoding information in dimensions have been passed down across such vast stretches of time that the connection is almost invisible, but still there if you look carefully enough. And this wonder is closer to what the builders intended. They wanted us to know that we're part of a longer story, that the struggle to understand the universe and our place in it didn't begin with us and won't end with us, that we're carrying forward a torch that's been passed through darkness multiple times, but never quite extinguished. The water laps at your feet with the same rhythm it's kept for millions of years, patient and eternal. And you understand now that the ocean is both destroyer and preserver. It swallowed the coastal cities and drowned the evidence of the world that was. But it also kept those ruins safe in the cold and the dark, where time moves differently, where stone doesn't weather, and structures can wait for technology to advance far enough that we can go down and look, and finally see what we lost. And maybe that's the ocean's gift, the preservation of truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable, even when it contradicts everything we've been taught about our origins and our uniqueness and our place in the timeline of civilization. You take a deep breath of the salt air and feel something settle in your chest. Not answers exactly, because there are still more questions than answers, still more ruins to explore and monuments to measure, and myths to decode. But a sense of connection, a feeling that you're part of something larger than one lifetime or one civilization, that the knowledge you carry is both gift and responsibility, inherited from people who fought to preserve it, and now entrusted to you to pass forward. And whether the next catastrophe comes in our lifetime or 1,000 years from now, whether we're wise enough to prepare or doomed to be caught unprepared like those who came before, at least now you know the pattern. At least now you understand what the silence beneath the waves and the testimony carved in stone have been trying to tell us all along. The stars are appearing overhead. The same stars that guided ancient navigators across oceans we can't cross without GPS. The same stars whose movements were tracked and encoded by astronomers whose names we'll never know, but whose knowledge survives in the angles and alignments of monuments that outlasted their empires. And you look up at that eternal clockwork, and you feel the weight of time, the vast stretches before and after this brief moment you occupy, and you understand that we're all just passing through, building what we can, preserving what we must, hoping that something of what we learn and create will survive to help whoever comes next. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any civilization can do, is plant seeds for a future they won't see, and trust that some of those seeds will take root and grow. Sleep well tonight with this knowledge settling into your bones. Let the rhythm of the waves carry you into dreams where drowned cities rise and ancient astronomers point toward stars that haven't changed position, and stone monuments stand guard over secrets they're finally ready to share. And when you wake tomorrow, you'll see the world with new eyes. You'll notice the patterns you missed before. You'll ask the questions that don't have comfortable answers. And you'll carry forward the understanding that everything we think we know about our past might be incomplete. That beneath the official history, there are layers of story still waiting to be excavated. And that the truth, when we finally assemble enough pieces to see its shape, will be stranger and more wonderful than any myth we've been told. If this journey has quieted your mind even a little, if it's helped you see that the questions are sometimes more valuable than the answers, then leave a like so I know you were here. And if you want to walk with me again through other mysteries the earth refuses to forget, I'll be waiting on the other side of sleep, where the stones remember and the water keeps its secrets, and the truth hides in plain sight for anyone brave enough to look.